On this episode, Scott and I welcome Dr. Olga Livingston, the principal security economist at CISA, where we'll be discussing the rating systems, firmware security, all kinds of interesting topics as it relates to the supply chain. So with that, we'll get on with the show.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
Welcome to Below the Surface, the firmware and supply chain podcast from Eclipsium in collaboration with the Cyber Risk Alliance. This is episode number 22. I'm joined by Mr. Scott Shefferman. Scott, welcome.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me on. Super excited about our guest, Olga, today. We're going to learn a lot from her. I'm super curious what it means to be a cyber economist in the context of CISA.
Yes, absolutely. Before we dig into it, Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. There you will find the ultimate guide to supply chain security. You can also find an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo, all that at eclipsium.com/go. Dr. Olga Livingston is a senior economist leading cyber economics portfolio at Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. Olga has a background in econometrics with an extensive experience in applied economic modeling and risk analysis. And we are delighted to have her on the show today. Olga, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it and looking forward to this good discussion. Very important topics. Thank you.
Olga, tell us a little bit about your background, because I think it's somewhat unique to some of the guests that we've had on the show.
So my background, mathematical economics and statistics, which is econometrics. And before joining, so I've been with CISA for 9 years now. Before joining CISA, I worked at the Pacific Northwest National Lab. And background is modeling there, energy economics, policy research. And over a course of years, learned what I could in cyber, by osmosis or active studying. And then now I'm in the firmware and image analysis space.
That's awesome. I want to talk about the economics of information security. That's really interesting. I've interviewed a lot of people on this topic, Olga, but none with your qualifications in economics, which is also a very difficult field of study, right? I think people think they understand it, but they really don't, right?
Yes and no, maybe so. I guess it's all relative, right? I feel the same way about engineering or firmware image analysis. Really appreciate being part of the interdisciplinary teams where all these very exquisite, intricate, and technical topics are combined together so we collectively can work on that. So information security, we kind of understand from the discussions out there, what is the economics of information security? You know, you can think about immediately simple questions that we're trying to answer as an industry, but might not necessarily have the right data to back it up. For example, cost of a cyber incident, seemingly trivial. There are a lot of sources that have estimates. Once you dig in and understand how those estimates are constructed, what are the technical bases, what are the assumptions, the methodological limitations, then you kind of try to discern, okay, which one of those are credible, which ones are not. Another example is, and now assume we know the cost of a cyber incident. How can we go from the per unit or cost per firm from an incident to what is a good risk-informed decision, risk management decision should be as far as whether I want to invest in more controls and mitigations, or I want to buy cyber insurance, right? Risk transfer mechanism. So all these are, these are manifestations of economics, economic analysis, statistical analysis. Another question that we also like to discuss is what compels different companies, different organizations to adopt various cybersecurity practices or technology, right? Innovation diffusion. It's marketing. Marketing is an extension of microeconomics. So there are multiple applications really rooted in a solid technical basis, where we try to understand rationale for decision and hopefully incentivize the right behavior.
Right. Yeah, I feel like we still have a long way to go with manufacturers and vendors that make hardware and software that we implement in the enterprise, right? I mean, we can almost set aside the consumer IoT market because that's a slightly different discussion, right? I do want to get there. But how do we, and so oftentimes in our role, right, our roles at Eclipsium and as security researchers in the security community, we're like, wow, we analyze this stuff that we want to put into an enterprise, and it has a lot of software flaws, vulnerabilities, exposures. How do we compel the vendors in order to fix those things? And oftentimes it's a question of economics. In your opinion, Olga, what can we do to incentivize more secure devices and software that get delivered to us?
Well, I think it's a recognition of the quality of the software, firmware being included, right, is one of the differentiating characteristics. Do we have sufficient information there to even penetrate the user conscious to make the case that there might be a higher profit margin associated with it? On the flip side, I also recognize the product release cycle in the software industry where it's rushed to the market, release now, fix later, and the oligopolistic nature of the competition. And if it's a tight profit margin, then QA is not something that we're going to pursue to the depth that would potentially improve the product, but also will delay the release and increase the cost. So quite often QA is looked as a cost center, and that's part of the potential issue or misaligned incentive that we need to address better as an industry, but better as an industry that's in a close collaboration with the government. Because at the end of the day, it's that public partnership, public-private sector partnership, collaboration of good faith that let us say, okay, we want to do this analysis. We want to enable user visibility into component dependencies of what it is that they're using, right? Direct or transient dependencies. To what extent the risk that is taken by the vendor community is then consequences and costs are faced by the users, adopters.
That's how we end up with vulnerable products because they're trying to compete. But I find it interesting in what you said, Olga, is that if we put, let's say, stringent federal regulations on makers of network switches, as an example, right? Just as a random example. If that means that there's only one company that can actually meet those requirements, now the competition goes out the window. And as consumers, we don't want that, right? Competition is very important to the economics of all this.
Fair point. And we also have a history of regulations in various industries, anything from energy efficiency to medical. So this is not the agency position, but I'll share this from the standpoint of Econ 101. Regulation is a blunt force trauma. If you don't have willingness from the industry to respect a certain level, baseline level of performance of best practices as standard of care, then if you have a regulation that might be premature or not reflective of the industry's baseline, you're going to see the negative consequence of it in low compliance and potentially limited enforcement. So we understand that. From the economic standpoint, limiting the competition also is not the desirable outcome. Nevertheless, how do we propagate this baseline through the market where regulation is appropriate if there's a market failure? Is this a market failure to differentiate the product based on the quality characteristics that may or may not be there, right? So it's an open-ended question. Somebody might say immediately, no, it's not, because it's not something that's important to the end user. Yes, no, maybe so, but it deserves a good faith dialogue as to what it is that we can accomplish now, what it is that would be a midterm goal, and where we can really closely, meaningfully collaborate with the industry. We had great advances in the SBOM community and working closely with Dr. Alan Friedman on that. Similarly, can we have a successful, productive collaboration where we understand the constraints, navigate carefully so we do not inadvertently negatively affect innovation and R&D and creativity that goes into it. I mean, U.S. is an innovation-driven economy. Nevertheless, we are respectful of the fact that we're loading consumers or end users with the consequences and costs associated with these consequences. while the decisions about the level of quality are made at the software development. So I'm not talking about testing and production.
And I don't want to make it seem like I'm anti-regulation. Sometimes I come off as that, even in my own head. I'm really not. I'm a huge fan of smart regulation, right? Because regulation in either extreme, too much or too little or none, right, has negative consequences. I think where the real happy medium, if you will, is in smart regulations. And I think the only way we get there is deep collaboration. I forget if it was Cory Doctorow or Bruce Schneier. They helped kind of form my opinions about regulation. And either one of them or both say, you know, in order to get smart regulation, you have to involve all the stakeholders, which includes folks like us, which includes the consumers, right? We all have to be in this feedback loop to get smart regulation, to educate the legislation here in the US, as an example, to put out regulation that does help people, right?
And I also do not want to hang the entire responsibility on regulation being able to address this, because it is a marketing problem, right? And how do we meaningfully address the misaligned incentives that are there? How do we work on compartmentalizing that risk, understanding that risk, and actually having just visibility into what are the potential sources or exposures are? And that's where we're struggling as an industry, right? Before we talk as regulation, good, bad, indifferent, that aside, do we have visibility into what it is that we're running, what our mission essential functions, if you're in the government or nonprofit sector or public sector, or if you're in a private sector, what are your primary lines of revenue? What do they depend on? What systems they depend on? What's the business impact analysis associated with that? And then what are the assets, like the full flow? What are the assets that are running everywhere? Do we know? Yes, no, maybe so. What's running on those assets? And we're talking software, name disambiguation, versionitis, end of life, end of support, exotic stuff. And then in turn, what subset of that is running on those critical assets supporting the critical functions or primary business revenue? And then that subset, what does it really depend on? Transient dependencies, direct dependencies, and prolific use of OSS. So open source software has been my particular point of interest. But once you get to that component level, hierarchical dependencies, you understand overall quality of the product. Is that a trivial undertaking? No. Do the end users, they have the right to know what they depend on? I think yes, it's an informed risk management decision that we're contemplating.
Sorry, Scott, you had a question.
Yeah, so Olga, you're making my mind just spin, and I love this dialogue because you're throwing out words super fast. Each one of those is its own kind of stick of dynamite to talk about, and it's just incredible to hear somebody canvas so much in just such concise answers here. You're mentioning visibility, but right before we go there, I feel like the one thing that we didn't quite address to frame this up all the way is that you might talk about regulation. When it comes to cybersecurity and things like firmware, things like SBOMs and open source software, I think it's important to look at, when you're looking at the economics, to look at the impact side and determine what kind of lane you're trying to address as a regulation authority or as a requirement, et cetera, because most of the people frame cybersecurity in an economic kind of business mindset. I'm losing data, that's intellectual property. I'm being ransomed, that's a ransom payment, right? And this is a financial burden and impact. But I think what's happening and what CISA is struggling to address and succeeding at the same time, but the struggle is, what do you do about things like safety and critical infrastructure and uptime? And the fact that cybersecurity is more and more impacting patient life in hospitals, or water safety and water authorities and gas line pipelines and things like this. I think once you start getting into like population safety and food supply safety and hospital impacts, patient life safety, I feel like you have to address things differently than just an economic, where you can have the free market kind of determine what that mean level of cost and burden should be based on the risk I'm willing to accept as a private enterprise. That's one conversation. But when you start talking about safety and life, that's another conversation. I think that's where regulation does have a really strong play and it's very proper. But when you're looking at, back to kind of the line of thought you're going down, when you're looking at an individual unit of, let's say, open source software, and you're trying to address what is the economics around this, it's very difficult unless you know the impact statement that you're willing to work with. right? Like, how much burden should be placed on an open source software development or somebody that acquires that and forks it and use it as an enterprise? If it's a pacemaker, that's one thing. If it's a video game, it's probably another, right? So what are your thoughts around, like, how do you frame this before you start even worrying about the economics?
Yeah, so I would say that is included in economics, because we naturally equate economics to dollars and cents, but we're talking about risk attributes and different types of consequences, right? Different dimensions of consequences. You brought up life as one of the metrics. Absolutely, that's important. However, in our existence, we also have a statistical value of life. That is not to reduce the meaning, but is to go back to Cass Sunstein's limits of quantification, saying a lot of these things, some of them are quantified, a lot of impacts, attributes, consequences. Impacts, some of them are quantifiable. Only a subset of quantifiable is monetizable. An example would be, to continue your logic, is civil liberties, election infrastructure. So we have this multi-attributes. It's not just dollar and cents. We fully recognize that, is that there's a portion that you can do the direct accounting on, but it's necessary, but it's not sufficient, and it's a lower bound. That is all understood. I think it's all rooted in a solid business case or business impact analysis, potential consequence analysis. That said, there are two different levels of decisions. One is a firm level or organization level, when they're looking at their own business impact analysis, deciding what are the critical dependencies, what are the systems, what is the software, and so on and so forth, what I've just described. There's another lens to look at the, let's say, OSS ecosystem, which is a market where cash doesn't change hands, right? There's creativity, there's innovation, there's a good faith product to solve a particular problem, where the developer is not necessarily rewarded. And then some of the products get orphaned. Do we need an orphanage at the end of life and of maintenance? Those are all almost different flavor of the questions if you look at it from the national standpoint. That is to say, is there are broader activities to help the ecosystem, to how do we address securing certain subsets of the ecosystems, functions within the ecosystems. So that is the long way. This is 6 ways of not answering a question, but in saying that it's a complex problem. That said, here's a part that could be addressed immediately, and how we carefully inform, not a misinformed decision. At the same time, we continue the dialogue and understand what are the importance criteria, what are the acceptance characteristics or acceptance criteria, right? The factors. How do we have this risk ontology framework? And there's a lot of work that's been done in this place. So how do we synthesize, understand what the factors are, and also carefully reconcile equities that are not always conflicting, sometimes they are, but reconcile that and say, what is really the role of the government in this? Regulation, remember, CISA is voluntary participation. Our regulation authority is like this. Everything else is meaningful technical advice, assistance, anything that enables and improves risk management decisions. So much broader, deeper dialogue than just dollar cents economic impact. It's enabling function. It's also convening to understand what the problems are and what are the best ways to address it without necessarily government addressing it directly. So myriad of problems. Which ones are the ones that we can address now, and what's palatable for the ecosystem and the method for it to be addressed, versus what are activities that need to be contemplated further down the line. Fully recognize that you mentioned different sectors, you mentioned different risk attributes and consequences. We have experience of working with this type of analysis in other contexts, for example, terrorism risk assessment, right? So I'm not talking about something that's not publicly available. We have reports on that. There is a lot of research done, Society of Risk Analysis, our partners throughout academia and research. The methodology is there. It's the data that's not necessarily there, but it's also that good faith collaboration where we can sit down and say, A, do no harm. The ecosystem, the innovation of our economy depends on that. B, how do we secure these, not prevalent, critical, but how do we secure specific segments, functions of this ecosystem that we also depend on, but we also do not know how to depend on them, right? So that's where I go towards visibility, or back to the visibilities. Do we know what assets are running where? Nope. Do we know what's running on those assets? No. Do we know what that software versionitis, disambiguated, unique set depends on? No. So this is beautiful, organic English garden. Stuff is growing, no one's mowing. We cannot be having the same conversation for 5 years without resolution. What are the problems that we can meaningfully address now with a level of collaboration, coordination, and good faith that might have from the industry now? And what are the broader topics, deeper topics to address further down the line?
But Olga, some of the vendors will, when you ask them if they will include a full SBOM for the product that they're shipping, that you also want visibility into the firmware so you can do some analysis once it comes from them. They often give economic reasons why. My intellectual property is important, so therefore I don't want to give you a full SBOM. And they don't want to give you decrypted versions of the firmware for the same reasons, right? How do we get them over that hump so that we have visibility, or is there some middle ground?
So you're absolutely right that there's either getting images from vendors at scale, or ripping the cover, attaching to the pins, and capturing the image. And okay, now that you have a stool sample of 3, what do you do with that? When you have 12 million of devices per site, probably 1.5 million of them unique. I'm just pulling the numbers, don't use it as an average. I think this is where being open to a meaningful dialogue, collaboration, hearing their equities, hearing the constraints, understanding what motivates those constraints, motivates those equities, is the first step, right? It's like we had the same thing with SBOM, where 10 years ago, nobody knew what SBOM was. 5 years ago, some knew but did not want to even participate. Now we're slowly moving towards some of the vendors being much more forthcoming and willing to collaborate. And we sincerely appreciate that, because that's where the most of the advance can happen. I think there will be leaders in this space that understand the level of risk they're accepting on behalf of their end user. I think there's a level of competitiveness, of a degree of product differentiation. I do not think that regulation is the answer or the only answer. So having the dialogue, understanding the motivation, and excuses could be given. But can we have a meaningful dialogue so we further get a level of comfort with all the parties present at the table and understand their equity? It's not that somebody's acting in bad intent. What are the equities and constraints? Can we have a good, healthy dialogue about that and understand which portions could be figured out now? Do I have a silver bullet or idea of how this could be solved, or broad spectrum antibiotic? Absolutely not. But I think the healthy dialogue and that meaningful collaboration, deep collaboration, is a necessary condition, is the absolute prerequisite for any of the progress in this space.
Yeah, I think we as the consumer have to push for that, right? To incentivize the vendors to have a more open dialogue and more open platform. I guess I'm a big fan of open platform. Has certain advantages when it comes to security.
Fair, and this is classic 101, not to go into teach mode, but supply and demand. If consumers are not requesting quality as a differentiating factor, what's the margin for developers to include that as a differentiation feature? On the other hand, if there's a supply, there will be demand, right? So it's like there's chicken egg problem, or catch-22, is that if we're not asking for it and we're not willing to pay for it, why would it be offered? On the other hand, well, if it's not offered, then we're not educating the consumers to what the art of the possible would be. And consumers, so I'm using consumer loosely, let's say end user, because the things that we have at home, important, but that's not the hospital, right? That's not a power plant. It's not a water treatment facility. So we have different kind of end users, different categories of end users. We certainly have critical infrastructure. But at the end of the day, do they have the right to know what they depend on and make a risk-informed decision, meaningful risk management decision? Yes. Is there room for working closely with vendors to improve the climate in this ecosystem? Absolutely, yes. So it's dialogue, understanding the equities, understanding the long-term horizon, art of the possible, what could be addressed now versus what could be marginally addressed later, incrementally addressed later, because there's not going to be broad spectrum antibiotic now. And if we're not moving and still having this discussion 5 years from now, we're still failing. I think meaningful collaboration, strong public-private partnership where government might not be asking for any information, but we certainly might be posing the questions and facilitating the places to convene and have that dialogue.
I feel like we've also explored the external certification path, right? Similar to how the FDA certifies products, although that's a whole different rabbit hole. There was a notion of a cyber UL, right? Like a rating system that, so you're not disclosing what's in your product to everyone. You disclose it to a trusted, maybe air quotes, trusted third party. They give it some kind of certification or rating similar to UL, Energy Star. And that is a path that we should pursue. Is there efforts in that area, and what are your opinions on that?
Well, so whether there are efforts and tolerances and interests, yes. And thank you for bringing Energy Star. It's a good example. When Energy Star started, there was a little realization that actually DOE label, right? Energy Star is a DOE label. It's a DOE program. We equated it with understanding the energy efficiency of the product. Similarly, we have LEED standards for buildings. What we do not have in the energy is an intelligent adversary that might adjust the behavior and consider that label being enticing, saying, pop me now. It's one of the considerations. Right. That's not the entire answer, but there are risks associated with that as well. And also, is that label static? Threat environment is very dynamic, quickly changing. What are the test cases? What are the test requirements, acceptance criteria? How quickly, efficiently this could be updated? So I do not have a good, full disclosures.
No, I agree.
Have an answer, right?
I agree, Olga. That's one of the things that makes this unique is the dynamic nature and how quickly it can change via an over-the-air update. So what's been certified today, right now, could change in the next 2 minutes. It takes a software update. Now it looks completely different, right? And that's very different from certifications that, as an example, the FDA is doing, right? When you package up food and you ship it, like it's not changing, right? Unless it spoils or goes bad. But you're not pushing an over-the-air firmware update to something static like that is shipped. And I think that's what's different about cybersecurity.
Yeah, so that's an interesting example, because if we do food and we do like medicine, we have temper seals. We have technology that's pursuing that type of capability or addressing that type of capability functionality now for firmware specifically. That said, that's the point is like, well, but if it's firmware update that's pushed out, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but nevertheless, every couple of weeks or every month, can you keep up with that? So again, having authoritative information from the vendors, what's baked in, is quite useful. Having an independent review cases and having a dynamic update on those review cases, you're absolutely right that overnight that might become irrelevant. There's a new vulnerability, and it doesn't need to be a 0 date, right? It can quickly become obsolete and give, on the one hand, give information if it's accurate and enable risk informed decision on the risk management. Flip side of it, it could also mislead and give a false sense of security associated with something that no longer is represented by the label or rating that's there. Right. I understand the complexity of that issue.
Well, using either the food analogy, it's like, I don't know, think of cigarettes. Like, even if you knew all 1,000 ingredients in a single cigarette, do you know which ones of those are malicious and have malicious intent or malicious impacts? So I think that's the one thing about SPON that always confounds me is like we're striving so hard to understand the what, but we're not understanding the whether or not it's malicious or can be used maliciously. And that kind of subtle difference between a backdoor and a vulnerability at this stage of the kind of chip wars and stuff that we're dealing with on the digital supply chain, where these backdoors are vulnerabilities are practically backdoors, right? Because they're just one bit away from being able to be exploited from anywhere on the internet. I don't know how we get there, and I don't know how you do the economics around maliciousness versus just understanding the what,
My typical response is necessary versus sufficient condition. Does that give you a complete picture? Not necessarily. However, is that a necessary required ingredient or ingredients redundant? Is it necessary to understand the ingredients? Does that give you a complete answer to everything? No. is that a prerequisite? I think yes, it's necessary versus sufficient. Because we can't say that, oh, if you cannot get 100%, accuracy, visibility, depth perception, therefore no information is useful. Right now we have a level of opacity that we can't even tell what we depend on, let alone to decide what we want to do and how we go from software assurance to software testing and so on and so forth, and how do we report the findings actually if we did find something.
Yeah,
I hear you. But we do not want to detract from the conversation of what the bare essentials or bare necessities are as far as what we want to know, versus how can we build further upon that and enhance the capability, right? One is not precluding the other being answered.
But there's similar models when we get to hardware as well, that if I look at the FCC, right? Mm-hmm. And if there's radio communications, RF communications, you have to go get FCC standard, right? And so us as hackers, right, we're like, well, the FCC publishes all of this, and they've got pictures like in the lab, and they're testing the devices, and you can actually go download those pictures and look at them. And I think that's an interesting model to follow if we were to extend that. And I believe the FCC is just making sure that it's communicating on the radio frequencies that it says that they're communicating on, right? Is like, I think, one of the major things that controls that they're checking for, right? Could we extend that? Because I don't think the FCC is a huge barrier to entry in the market. It's something that everyone knows, how to do.
If we were to extend that, how would that application look like? Just walk me through the logic, so when I'm answering, I'm responding.
Yeah. So could we use that to extend it into hardware, right? That would be maybe a more complex process, but one of the concerns we have in the supply chain is the hardware, right? Has the hardware been backdoored? Is it, what type of hardware is in it? Is it the hardware in it that they say that is in it? Are there known issues, security or not, with that particular hardware?
Yes, I understand. So the question would be, who would have that independent view, test bench, to answer the question conclusively, defensively, in a way where the methodology is transparent, understood, we understand what the testing benchmarks are, and how do we expand that across the entire nomenclature, right? The variability of all the things that we're using.
There's a lot of hardware out there, right?
Yeah. So and how about legacy, right? So how do we go from the step in answering that question is what hardware is out there, right? So what's the nomenclature that I'm trying to cover? What portion of that is legacy? What portion of that is technical debt? And I think that's partly what I'm trying to answer with, is within the framework of my project. Is do we have an understanding of at least that, so we can, for mathematics, what's the way to solve the infinitely dimensional problem? You want to reduce it down to the least complex common subproblem. So that's a long way to say, how can we chip this work, this workflow, this horizon of analytics, analytic agenda into pieces that we can meaningfully address now with what we have now, where we can augment R&D, analysis, whatnot, which part of that is scalable, and then where the boundary of that is and how we advance it further. So in saying it's like, yeah, let's have, I don't want to say certification UL for hardware. It's like, yeah, there's a lot of hardware there. First, there's a legacy hardware. Second, third, we don't even know what's running where. No, O&M swapped something. I mean, think about visibility past PLC, right? Programmer logic controller. Asset discovery works well if you know what's on the other side. Do you know what's on the other side? What machine is that Excel spreadsheet stored on, or list stored on? So there are a lot of things that could be done to address the basics, right? Anything from asset identification and management to how do we get a deeper view as to what that depends on and what it constitutes. Do we recognize it as a gap? Is it a gap that in comparison with the other priorities is the one that worth pursuing addressing? So theoretically, yes. It's like agree with everything in principle and then fight implementation every step. How is that going to be implemented? I think that's the details that would be crucial in defining the success or willingness of the industry to collaborate. And again, it's willingness of industry to collaborate and us having meaningful relationship and partnership in being able to address these problems jointly.
Yeah, and I think given the challenges that we've identified, even the past few minutes, right? I think one of the things for me that if I were a CISO and I'm acquiring technology, maybe I know I'm not going to get like a really truly accurate list of every single chip and connector, inside the hardware, because that's extremely challenging. However, one thing for me that I think is important is some of the behaviors in the various players in the supply chain and how they treat updates and security. And you mentioned end of life already, Olga, right? I think that's maybe a shorter win is to start evaluating based on how long you're going to support the software that powers this chip, right? And how long you're going to fix vulnerabilities for it, and maybe what's your track record in doing that, or is there some certification that you're going to follow this standard moving forward to support this chip? Because a lot of the problems we have today are based on components that some researcher discovers as vulnerable. No, it's too late. It's in millions of systems, and the chip is still out there. So what do we do about it?
Well, music to my ears for the following reason. On the one hand, it's like, are you going to inspect every piece of equipment and do non-destructive examination? No. You want to know what their quality assurance program looks like.
Right.
Flip side of that, right? Software development lifecycle being part of that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, flip side of it, on the consumer side, on the agency firm side, those that are end users of the software, their CISA risk management decision. What kind of cyber risk management program do they have in place, right? It's not whether there is a label, it's whether there are those that meaningfully understand how to deal with that label. So we've at CISA developed an assessment that looks specifically into that, cyber risk management, and it has 3 components to it. One is, do you have cyber risk management program in place? How mature it is? Second component to that, or theme, is, and how well it's integrated into enterprise risk management. Because cyber could be ahead in its island of its own, or cyber could be lagging. So it's how it's integrated in the overall enterprise risk management, how proficient this entity is at making other risk management decisions, have to do with physical infrastructure, whatnot. Is simply put, if you have a safety assessment report or site study, you might have multiple initiators for various types of events, right? Cyber is one of them. Do you have that other machinery to look at other risks besides cyber? Because cyber is just type of operational risk for them, strategic for those that are in the cybersecurity industry. And then the third piece to that program is, so you have a program, cyber risk management program, mature or not, how well it's integrated. And then the third one is, what governance do you have in place such that you have a communication between tier 1 C-suite, tier 2 operational, tier 3 tactical, and it flows in both directions, right? And it enables the effective functionality or effective use of the cyber risk management and enterprise risk management approaches, right? So is there a cyber risk program in place? How is it integrated into enterprise risk management? Is there governance structure in place? If that's how we assess cyber risk management on the end user side, the equivalent of that by symmetry would be assessing that on the vendor side, with the recognition, of course, that quality assurance often perceived as a cost center, and it could be one of the first ones to get cut down. If the tides change in the economy, so also a challenge to keep in mind.
Is also in evaluating the vendor, is there? And I know I've talked with Casey Ellis about this, their vulnerability disclosure policy. So if a researcher were to find a vulnerability in a vendor's product, I feel like that vendor should have some way to communicate, this is what I do, and this is how we handle it. Is that part of it?
So I think, yes, and some vendors are much more proactive than others. And in doing the research on challenges or barriers to software testing by end users or third parties, that came to be as one of the potential challenges, is that user level agreement aside, there are multiple themes to negotiate, discuss there. But assume we've done the testing, we report, and then it goes in the black hole. If it's a bounty program, and then somebody finds it, gets paid, and then sign non-disclosure agreement, that goes into a black hole. Is this something that should be regulated? I hope not. I do not want, this is not CISA speaking, this is Olga speaking from the Econ 101. Understanding is that is not going to be, it's going to be blunt force trauma. That is not going to help either the users or the vendors. What can we meaningfully collaborate on and agree on as a palatable approach? What is the frequency, right? Periodicity. How fast the findings are reported, how fast the actions are taken on the findings. There's no good or bad policy, and I say that to my students all the time. It's a matter of who does what to whom and who's paying for it. They're winners, they're losers, their benefits, their losses. What are they, how they're distributed? I think that's an important part of understanding.
Yeah, it's interesting. You make me want to go to a consumer-based choice based on whether or not the vendor in this example complies to some standard, right? So rather than having the government enforce regulation, blunt force trauma, as you put it, which I think is very appropriate, right? You say, well, we're going to create this one or two, or it can be multiple, like standards, and the consumer gets to choose. Do I want to buy the product where they're conforming to this standard for vulnerability disclosure, or someone that doesn't? And then we have to evangelize and get that into the purchasing process.
Yeah, thank you. Good point. So that feeds back into marketing, extension of microeconomics, and also how consumers make choices about adopting anything. So there are three broad classes of innovation diffusion models. Heterogeneous population, meaning people decide based on different mechanisms. One is contagion. Monkey see, monkey do. That's your, Uggs, North Face jacket across all the universities in the U.S. as a uniform.
Stanley mugs, right? They contain lead. They contain lead, and people are freaking out now, right?
So the contagion is literally fashion explained by contagion model. We come into contact with the doctor. We're not necessarily relying on any information about the performance. We just see and repeat. Second model is a little bit more advanced, nevertheless. You understand how decision triggered, you don't understand the rationale. And decision is, you see that in the commercials. 25% of the market are using this toothpaste, or 10% of the doctors recommend this toothpaste. There is no evidence or evidentiary threshold as whether that works, if at all. But here in that adoption threshold triggers the further adoption decision. And there's a third one. It's social learning. Social learning is the one that you're talking about, is what characteristics do we have baked into communication? That is communication that's generated by all the prior adopters in all there's double integral there, so I'm doing it in the air. All prior adopters in all the periods of time that they use in this over. So compare that with hybrid corn adoption in the beginning of the previous century. It's not hearing from the salesperson that this shiny thing is going to address all the problems. It's hearing from the neighbors saying the yield is 3 or whatever, 8 times higher. So it's that critical information about the features, differentiating characteristics, but more importantly, performance. Evidence-based performance information that explains the rationale of that decision. And I think that's the space where we're in, where we have, on behalf of government, right, where we have particular acquisition rules that we need to stick by, and we do want to have prior performance results and understand how the tech works. Similar in the private sector, those are very hefty investments. We want to have a communication, clear messaging, and understanding what's relevant, what's useful, to accompany any kind of a contemplation, what's a good tech, or what's good label, or what's a good program, or what's a vulnerability disclosure practice. What are those relevance categories of factors, and what good looks like? So absolutely right, and this is explained by the marketing and microeconomics. Question is, how do we apply that to cyber? What are the differentiating characteristics for the products that are relevant to the consumer, and where do we need to educate the consumers to what they need to look for?
And how do we get not to be competing on price, right? What you're saying is make these other factors more important than the common denominator when someone goes to buy something, whether it's an enterprise or a consumer. I mean, price is number one on the list.
Yes, and we're going to end up with a DUF or DUF light. That if it's a perfect competition on a very narrow margin, then price equals to average cost, right? Everybody's competing based on that, and there is not much room there. That said, software market is not necessarily that, right? We have some of our more prolific actors. It's more of ballistic. It's game theory, right? What it is that you think your competitor is going to do in response to whatever action you take. Interesting to discuss, very hard to manage and navigate.
Yeah, you're right. With software, it's more complex than price, right? It's a lot about experience, right? And all the times in my career, and there have been several, where we've considered adoption of a particular software platform, right? Price is in there, but it's more about, like, we're going to be able to run this and have it support the business without chaos and a fiasco ensuing in our software. And I think security should and does in many cases enter into that, because that can then create a fiasco down the road, and we want to avoid that. I think we're more aware of that when we adopt software more so than hardware. I think with hardware, we're more worried about, well, we're going to get it in, and yeah, it might have been cheaper, but it's not going to last as long, or we're going to have to replace it, and with the thing that was more expensive at the end of the day. So why don't I just get the better quality?
Fair, and to add or extend that is, security is important. That said, in working with SMBs and private sectors, to what are the primary concerns, let's say for SMBs, right? What are the primary concerns for SMBs? Security is not the top.
No, it's cost.
Important, but it's not the top priority. So the first one would be securing regulatory compliance, securing financing, finding talent, retaining customers, getting new customers, then cybersecurity. How do we recognize that and navigate accordingly? So yes, it's not just the price. That said, there are other decisions that small, medium-sized businesses make when they buy software, hardware, or how many pounds of security can I get for $100? And in those decisions are reflected their resource constraints. So how do we tread lightly, knowing that security is important? It's important for us, but it's not the only important factor for any business that's out there in existence.
Yeah, I feel like that's true until ransomware happens, and then the priority shifts.
Yeah,
I was going to say something similar, which is most consumers are heavily reliant, like 80, 90, 100% of their lives are entirely reliant on the 4 or 5 primary data centers in, let's say, this country. And so if you look at this problem just from like even consumer protection, you really should just focus, like, first things first. I think you were saying this earlier, Olga, how do you reduce this giant complex problem space down to a few actionable things that have the most impact, where you can probably have actually the most visibility too on the topic of visibility, which is looking at these homogeneous massive data centers where we still, to your point, don't have good visibility into what the SBOM is, or what we call the F-bomb here at Eclipsium, the firmware bill of materials. We still don't even know what is in those data centers. The data centers don't even know what's in the data centers. And it's all because they're implicitly trusting, and have been for the last 40 years of computing, they're trusting the vendor that supplies the thing. So when they buy something, they know what they're buying, but when they take delivery of it, they're not verifying it before they even trust that what they bought is what's delivered. And even if they buy the same
Scott, they're like, great, I don't need my own data center, and there's a cost. So again, it comes down to cost. I don't need my own computing infrastructure. I'm not going to run QuickBooks on a PC in the closet anymore. I'm going to go run it in the cloud, right? And
but the cloud doesn't even have anything that we're talking about, like even in the primary sense. And so the cloud providers are impacted. But then again, all these consumers that rely on that cloud, like if I buy a laptop or an iPhone or a router, none of these things mean anything if the data center infrastructure is compromised or isn't available, right? Because these widgets here are only meant to provide us a UI for all the stuff living in those data centers, right, that we use to buy and eat and sleep and do everything we do in our lives. So it's just kind of wild to me that even at that core primary nexus of compute and data and services, we don't even have visibility that Olga's talking about yet.
So that's the gap that we're trying to address, and it's having the capability. We're working jointly, so CISA and Science and Technology Directorate at the Department of Homeland Security, we're working jointly how we can stitch together. So this is not crowding out and government writing code. No, this is how can we take mature COTS, commercial of the show, best in breed COTS for specific type of functionality. Frankenstein it together in this modular workflow, and the vendors that would be working with, they are the ones that critical infrastructure owners and operators already expressed as a preference by the mere adoption of that capability, right? How do we work with those that are best of breed for various functionality, have this workflow, integrated workflow, such that if you have a preference for a particular vendor, you can switch it out, but the data changes hands in one standard format, and we all understand how to interpret the data that we're getting back, or what decisions could be supported by the data, so it's integrated in a meaningful fashion, and again, palatable for CI to adopt, to get that visibility. Step one, asset discovery, and seeing past PLC. That's like opaque space right there, right? Purdue level 2 below. So where the sun doesn't shine and Ethernet is gone. So then from that, what software running all of that? Which one is IT? Which one is IT to OT? And which one is pure OT? We have a complete capacity over here. And it's like, I'm not breaking any secrets, right? We recognize that as a gap as an industry. That's where we're allocating resources to improve the capability. In doing so, also understanding that we are at the mercy of the manufacturers to be able to meaningfully work together on this deeper analysis, whether it's SBOM generation, verification, and whatnot, and that's Alan Friedman's space, so I don't want to be off message speaking about it. That said, while we're waiting for industry and the government to come together on the palatable bare minimum of what software of SBOM should contain, and how it should be generated, what authoritative is, how we're enabling owners and operators to make these decisions with the level of capacity that we have right now. That is not sustainable either. And it's not something that's palatable to remain as is in the short term. We understand that visibility and dependence on OSS is one of the issues that we can meaningfully immediately address. But again, it's collaboration in good faith with vendors, because can somebody go and test? Yeah, sure. I mean, take the cover, whatever attached to the pins, rip the image. That's one stool sample. I mentioned that before. I want everybody to walk away with that visual. It's like, we cannot do this at scale. We cannot meet, it's necessary capability. Trust but verify. You need to have the capability to capture and verify. That said, it's not a sustainable long-term business model. So what is the medium ground that we can collaborate on to address that visibility gap?
Yeah, and I think, but what I hear you saying, Olga, is it's a shared responsibility model, going back to Scott's kind of cloud analogy as well. This is a shared responsibility model, and it has to be pushed as such, as we share this responsibility. And I've always said in the supply chain, everyone has a role and a responsibility. We need to make sure those are defined and make sure that they're well evenly distributed, right?
Shared responsibility and understanding of the equities, because at the end of the day, that's what drives business decisions. And I appreciate the example of the data centers, but we isolate data centers. So in isolating data centers in that example, we have an implicit decision about relative worthiness of various functions, of various capabilities, or portions of economy, and how this economy is sustained and advancing. I would not want to be in the position of determining the relative worthiness of the data centers versus hospitals, right? So I don't want it to. We have national critical functions; those are defined. Also, they're defined in a way that we understand the complexity and multiple dependencies and the interdependencies baked into each one of them. That said, right, I don't want it to also be a gloom and doom. Revolution season 2, there is no grid, no electricity, and we're going back to Bunsen burners. Not the case. So there is an meaningful attempt to advance in that space and understand those dependencies, but it is a complex problem to solve. It's not going to be solved immediately. And again, it's back to shared responsibility, which means it's a dialogue.
Awesome. Are there other things that you're working on at CISA, Olga, that you want to tell our audience about?
Yes. Something that is very relevant to this analysis is understanding controls effectiveness, right? That is another topic that is near and dear for cyber insurance. We have controls frameworks. They've existed for quite some time, but do we have our better depth perception as to the effectiveness of those controls. So that's another area where we can have mutual benefit from very strong collaboration. Right? So it's which controls are bloodletting and which ones are penicillin. We've had consensus-based framework based on the information that was the best information available at the time. That was, circa 2007, 2010, 2015 is when I joined CISA. Some of the conversations are still very similar to what we had back then. How can we jointly invest that, right? So CISA has CPG's cyber performance goals. Those are the floor, not the ceiling. We need to advance that, mature that, but how do we enhance? It's not a requirement, right? It's how do we enhance our common understanding of what good looks like? What is the evidence threshold and how we can substantiate adoption decision, what I talked about earlier, in that social learning model with no-nonsense, empirically based performance information. So that's something where I'm seeking collaboration and working with, we have initiative associated with that. So you'll be hearing me talking about it at every quarter in the next cyber summits for probably 3-4 months at least, and then 3-4 years out thereafter. But it's a critical piece that we're also missing. On the one hand, we have opacity or lack of visibility into what the exposures, what the issues, dependencies are. On the other hand, we also have a limited understanding or empirical basis, technical basis, to postulate which controls are effective.
Yeah, and often that's I find somewhat dated. In maybe not every compliance standard, right? And I love our friends at NIST, right? But sometimes it's when I oppose this, right? It's usually because it's either outdated or not applicable in this case, and there needs to be a way to manipulate that control or change that control, or maybe get rid of it altogether for that particular use case. So I love the work on how do we measure the efficacy of controls, because oftentimes I'm like, seriously, like maybe 10 years ago that might have helped, but not now.
When that's the feedback. Now, NIST is a dear collaborator. They work with a consensus process that reflects and allows the vibrant opinions from various agents and players in this community to be incorporated, represented, and meaningfully addressed. But we do recognize that consensus-based framework is not the same as ongoing operational validation of that initial prior opinion, what we think would have worked. So in the medical community, it's protocols. We're not there yet. We're working in that direction. But remember, CISA cannot touch anybody's system, good or bad, opinion aside. We're working with the industry. We're at the mercy of the industry to have this meaningful private-public sector partnership where this data can change hands and questions being answered. And it's not give CISA data. It's share the data with whoever you trusted partners are in a way that it could be aggregated, meaningfully analyzed, and then having CISA's question, broader community questions answered. For example, we're partnering with Stanford on looking into controls effectiveness, but it's to the extent that cyber insurance is willing to participate and collaborate with us, for which we're immensely thankful.
Well, fantastic. Olga, thank you so much for appearing on Below the Surface today. It was wonderful having you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it, and thanks for entertaining my opinions. Remember, they don't represent the agency.
Thank you. With that, we'll see everyone next time. Thanks for listening and watching.